The morning of her sister's wedding, Marielle Verhoeven pressed a square of lace against her mouth so that no one in the next room would hear the sound she was making. It was not crying, exactly. It was the noise a person makes when grief arrives faster than the body can prepare for it. A sound caught somewhere between a breath and a word that never finished forming. Through the thin plaster wall, she could hear the wedding guests laughing, the clink of glasses, and a fiddle being tuned. And she could hear his voice, Tomas, the man who, only 3 years ago, had taken her hands in the back garden under the pear tree and told her to wait for him. So she had waited. She had waited through 3 winters, 3 springs, and 100 small promises whispered into her hair. And now he was downstairs, in his good gray coat, marrying her younger sister Ada instead. How does a woman end up here? That is the question. How does a person give 3 years of her one short life to a man, only to watch him walk past her on the way to the altar, as though she were a coat left hanging in the hall? To understand that, you have to go back. You have to understand who Marielle was before the world taught her what loyalty costs. Marielle was the eldest daughter of a clockmaker in a small river town, where the fog came in every evening and settled over the cobblestones like a gray woolen blanket. Her father, Hendrik, was a quiet man, with ink-stained fingers and a back permanently bent from leaning over tiny gears. The family was not poor, but they were not comfortable either. They lived in the narrow rooms above the workshop, where the air always smelled faintly of machine oil and the brass polish her father used on the clock faces. From the time she was 12, Marielle had worked beside him, her small fingers better suited than his aging ones to the delicate springs and screws. She learned patience there, hunched over the workbench in the lamplight. She learned that good things take time, that you do not rush a mechanism, that the most beautiful clocks are the ones assembled slowly and with care. It was a lesson that would later break her heart. Ada, the younger sister, was a different creature entirely. Where Marielle was steady, Ada was bright and quick and restless, like a sparrow that could never sit still on a branch. People were drawn to Ada the way they are drawn to a warm fire on a cold night. She laughed easily. She forgot her troubles easily, and she had a way of making whoever stood in front of her feel like the only person in the room. Marielle loved her. That is the part that people forget when they hear this story. Marielle did not hate her sister. She had rocked Ada to sleep when their mother died of the coughing fever. She had sewn Ada's dresses and braided Ada's hair, and lied to their father more than once to keep Ada out of trouble. The love between them was real, and it was old, and that is exactly what made everything that came after so unbearable. Tomas Brandt came into their lives on a wet autumn afternoon, carrying a broken pocket watch that had belonged to his late father. He was a land surveyor by trade, a tall young man with serious dark eyes and a careful way of speaking, as though he weighed each word before letting it go. He set the watch on the counter and asked, in a low voice, whether it could be saved. Most repairmen would have said no. The mechanism was ruined, the casing dented, the glass long gone. But Marielle picked it up, turned it over in her palm, and felt something she could not name. She told him she would try. It took her 2 weeks. She worked on it late at night, after her father had gone to bed, replacing the tiny broken parts one by one, and when she finally handed it back to Tomas, fully wound and ticking again, he looked at her as though she had performed a miracle. He came back the next week, and the week after that, always with some small excuse, some little thing that needed fixing. They both knew the truth of why he kept returning. Their courtship was slow and gentle, built in the quiet hours, at the edge of her father's workshop. Tomas was not a wealthy man, and he was honest about it. He told Marielle that he had a plan. There was work in the eastern provinces, surveying land for the new railways, and the pay was good. If he went for 3 years, he said, he could come back with enough to buy them a house of their own. A real house, with a garden and a room with good light, where she could keep her own clockmaking bench. He took her hands beneath the pear tree behind the house, the one that dropped its hard little fruit every September, and he asked her to wait. He did not give her a ring. He could not afford one. Instead, he gave her his father's pocket watch, the one she had brought back to life, and he told her that as long as it was ticking, his promise was alive. Marielle held that watch to her chest and said yes. She was 22 years old, and she believed, with the whole of her heart, that her patience would be rewarded. The first year, his letters came often. They were not beautiful letters, because Tomas was not a poet, but they were warm, and they were steady, and she read each one until the paper grew soft at the folds. The second year, the letters came less. She told herself it was the distance, the unreliable post, the long stretches when his surveying work took him deep into the mountains, where no rider could reach. She kept the watch wound. Every single night, before she slept, she turned the little crown between her thumb and finger and listened to the steady tick, and she let that small sound be her proof that he was still out there, still coming home to her. The third year, the letters stopped almost entirely, and then, in the early spring, a single letter arrived, but it was not addressed to her. It was addressed to Ada. Marielle did not open it. She wanted to. God knows she wanted to, but she was not the kind of woman who read another person's letters, not even her sister's. So she handed it to Ada, and watched her sister's face as she read it, and she saw something cross Ada's expression that she would spend years trying to understand. Guilt, perhaps, or fear, or the particular shame of a person who has wanted something they were never supposed to want. Ada folded the letter quickly and said it was nothing, just news from Tomas that he was coming home. And Marielle, fool that she was, felt her heart lift like a bird. He was coming home. After 3 long years, the waiting was finally over. What she did not know was that, during the long months of silence, Tomas had been writing to Ada all along. It had started innocently enough, a few friendly lines tucked into his letters home, small jokes meant for the lively younger sister. But somewhere across the distance, in the loneliness of those far provinces, something had shifted. Ada wrote back, in a way that made him laugh. Ada's letters were full of light, full of the easy charm that had always drawn people to her. And Tomas, tired and cold and far from home, had found himself waiting for her words more than anyone's. By the time he boarded the coach for the long journey back, the man who had promised himself to Marielle under the pear tree was already half in love with someone else. And Ada, who loved her sister, who genuinely loved her, had let it happen anyway. That is the cruelest thing about the human heart. It does not always ask permission, and it does not always care who it wounds. He arrived on a Thursday. By the following week, the whole town knew. And Tomas Brandt was to be married, not to the patient eldest daughter of the clockmaker, but to her younger sister. And the wedding would be soon, far too soon, the kind of haste that sets tongues wagging in a small town. Marielle learned the truth not from Tomas, and not from Ada, but from a neighbor who assumed she already knew. The woman mentioned it lightly over the garden fence, the way people mention the weather, and Marielle stood there with a basket of wet laundry in her arms, and felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. She did not scream. She did not weep. Not then. She simply walked back inside, climbed the narrow stairs to her room, and took out the pocket watch. It was still ticking. After everything, it was still faithfully, mercilessly ticking. And that small, steady sound, the sound that had carried her through 3 years of waiting, was now the cruelest sound of rice. There is a particular kind of silence that fills a house on the morning of a wedding nobody in it truly wants to discuss. Marielle moved through that silence like a ghost. She had not been asked to be a bridesmaid. Nobody had dared. But she could not bring herself to leave the house either, because leaving would have been an announcement, a way of telling the whole town that the eldest Verhoeven daughter had been cast aside, and Marielle had too much pride for that. So she stayed in her room above the workshop, behind the thin plaster wall, with her father's old wedding quilt pulled up to her chin and the lace pressed to her mouth. Down below, her sister was being married to the man who had promised himself to her under the pear tree. And the worst part, the part that made her stomach turn, was that some small and shameful corner of her heart was still listening for Tomas to stop, to say her name, to come up the stairs, take the watch from her hands, and tell her it had all been a terrible mistake. He did not come up the stairs. Of course he did not. Marielle heard the vows spoken faintly through the floorboards, heard the cheer that went up afterward, heard the fiddle start to play a bright dancing tune, and she understood, finally and completely, that the life she had spent 3 years building in her own mind had never existed at all. It had been a clock she assembled alone in the dark, ticking away to no one. She rose from the bed. She washed her face in the cold water of the basin, and she made a decision that would change the entire course of her life, though she could not have known it at the time. She decided that she would not spend one more night under a roof where her own grief had become an embarrassment to be hidden. She would leave. Her father found her packing. Hendrik stood in the doorway with his ink-stained hands hanging useless at his sides, an old man suddenly looking older, and he said the only thing a man like him knew how to say. He told her she did not have to go, but they both knew that she did. He pressed what little money he had into her palm, folded her fingers over it the same way Tomas once had, and he held her for a long moment in the doorway of the only home she had ever known. Then Marielle walked down the narrow stairs, past the open door of the celebration, where she caught one single glimpse of Ada in her wedding dress, laughing, radiant, already turning away. And Marielle walked out into the fog with one small bag, the clothes on her back, and her father's pocket watch ticking against her heart. She did not know where she was going. That is the honest truth of it. She walked to the edge of town where the river road bent toward the hills, and she kept walking, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant pain. The fog was thick that evening, the kind that swallows the road 10 feet ahead and makes the whole world feel like a held breath. By the time full dark came, she was cold, exhausted, and lost, and the rain had begun to fall in fine cold needles that soaked through her thin coat. She was beginning to understand the danger she had walked into. A woman alone on a country road at night was not safe, and she had been so consumed by escaping her grief that she had not thought of practical things like shelter, or food, or what might be waiting in the dark. It was then, through the curtain of rain, that she saw the lights. They were the lights of a great house, set back from the road behind tall iron gates, the kind of estate that ordinary people only ever saw from a distance. Marielle hesitated at the gate. Every rule she had ever been taught told her to keep walking, that a place like this was not for someone like her. But the cold had reached her bones, and her legs would not carry her much farther, and so she did the only thing she could. She lifted the heavy iron ring on the gate and let it fall, and the sound rang out into the wet night, like the toll of a bell. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a lantern appeared, bobbing down the long drive, carried by an old woman in a gray shawl who peered at Marielle through the bars of the gate with sharp, suspicious eyes. The woman asked her business in a hard voice. Marielle, soaked and shivering, could barely form the words. She said she was lost. She said she only needed shelter from the rain. A corner of a barn would do, and she would be gone by morning. The old woman looked her up and down for a long moment, taking in the cheap coat and the small bag and the exhaustion written across her face. And then something unexpected happened. The old woman's face softened, just slightly, and she unlocked the gate. She said the master of the house did not turn away travelers on a night like this, and she led Marielle up the long gravel drive toward the great dark house, where a single window on the upper floor glowed with candlelight, and where a man stood watching from behind the glass. The master of the house was not what Marielle expected. She had built a picture in her mind on the walk up the drive. Some gray-haired nobleman with a cold manner, and no patience for a half-drowned stranger. Instead, the man who came down to the warm kitchen where the old housekeeper had sat Marielle by the fire was perhaps 40 years old, tall and lean, with dark hair just beginning to silver at the temples, and a face that seemed carved from quiet sorrow. He moved with a slight limp, leaning on a cane of dark polished wood, and there was something in the way he held himself, careful and contained, that told Marielle here was a man who had also known grief. He introduced himself simply. He was Duke Aldrich Ravensmore, and this was his estate, and she was welcome to stay the night, and as long as she needed beyond it. Now, you must understand something about Duke Aldrich Ravensmore, because the people of the surrounding villages certainly understood it, and they spoke of it only in whispers. The Duke was a man wrapped in mystery. He had inherited the estate years ago, but he kept almost no company. He did not attend the balls and dinners that men of his station were expected to attend. He had been married once, the whispers said, to a woman of great beauty, and she had died, and after her death, the Duke had withdrawn from the world entirely. Some said he had been crippled in the same accident that killed his wife. Some said he was cursed. Some said far darker things. What was certain was that the great house on the hill had not welcomed a guest in years, and that the servants who remained were fiercely loyal and tight-lipped, and that no one in the valley truly knew what went on behind those iron gates. And now, on the worst night of her life, Marielle Verhoeven had walked straight through them. She slept that first night in a guest room, larger than her entire home above the workshop, in a bed so soft she did not trust it, and she did not sleep well at all. She lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the great house, settling in the dark, the wind in the eaves, the distant tick of some enormous clock somewhere below. And in the small hours, when she could not sleep, she did the thing she always did. She took her father's pocket watch from beside the bed and turned the little crown between her fingers, listening to its steady sound. It was the only familiar thing in this strange new world. It was the last thread connecting her to a life that had ended on the river road. In the morning, she meant to leave. She truly did. But the rain had not stopped, and the housekeeper, whose name was Mrs. Halden, insisted she could not go out in such weather, and pressed a warm breakfast on her, and a dry change of clothes. And then a strange thing happened. As Marielle sat in the great hall, waiting for the rain to pass, she noticed a clock on the mantelpiece, a beautiful old long-case mechanism with an ornate brass face, and it was silent, stopped, frozen at some hour-long past. Without thinking, drawn by an instinct older than her grief, she rose and went to it, and opened the little door in its case, and peered inside at the still mechanism. And it was there, with her hands inside the works of a stranger's clock, that she heard the Duke's voice behind her. He asked her, quietly, what she thought she was doing. Marielle turned, embarrassed, her cheeks burning, and she began to apologize. But then she saw that the Duke was not angry. He was looking at her hands, at the way they rested so naturally among the gears, and there was something in his expression that she could not read. She told him the truth. She told him she was a clockmaker's daughter, that she had worked the trade her whole life, and that the clock was not broken, not truly. It only needed cleaning, and a small adjustment to the escapement. She could fix it, she said, if he would allow her. And the Duke, this silent, grieving man, who let no one into his house and trusted no one with his secrets, looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something that made her heart stop. He said that the clock had not run since the day his wife died, and that he had paid 3 different masters to repair it, and that all 3 had told him the mechanism was beyond saving. He said it as a kind of warning, or perhaps a kind of dare. And Marielle, looking into the works of that frozen clock, felt the very same thing she had felt years ago, when Tomas first laid his broken watch on her counter. She felt that she could bring something dead back to life. She asked him for a day. He gave her 3. What neither of them knew in that quiet moment by the silent clock, was that the repair of one stopped mechanism would become the repair of two broken hearts. Marielle worked on that clock for 3 days, in the great cold hall, with the Duke watching from a chair by the window and saying little, and slowly, hour by hour, something began to thaw between them. He began to ask questions, she began to answer, and piece by piece, the way she had always done her best work, Marielle began to understand that the mystery of Duke Aldrich Ravensmore was not darkness at all, but something far more familiar to her own wounded heart. It was grief, the same as hers, the exact same grief, worn by a different soul. But the suspense of this story is not yet over, because the past Marielle had fled was not finished with her. And far away in the river town, a wedding celebration had soured into something cold, and a man named Thomas Brandt had begun, too late, to understand the magnitude of what he had thrown away, in the world. On the third evening, just as the light was failing through the tall windows of the great hall, Marielle set the final gear back into place, closed the little brass door, and lifted the heavy pendulum with 2 fingers. She gave it the gentlest push, and the old long-case clock, silent since the day the Duke's wife had died, began to tick. The sound filled the hall, slow and deep and steady, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The Duke rose from his chair by the window, leaning hard on his cane, and crossed the room to stand before the clock he had given up on years ago. He did not speak, but Marielle saw his jaw tighten and his eyes grow bright, and she understood that he was not hearing a clock at all. He was hearing time begin to move again, in a house where it had stood frozen for so long. He was hearing permission, finally, to let the past be the past. That night, they talked until the candles burned low. The Duke told her about his wife, Eleanor, who had died when their carriage overturned on an icy road, the same accident that had shattered his leg and left him with the limp. He told her how he had blamed himself, how he had withdrawn from the world because he could not bear the pity in people's faces, how he had stopped every clock in the house because he could not stand to watch time carry him further and further from the last day he had been whole. And Marielle, in turn, told him everything. She told him about Thomas and the pear tree, and the 3 years of waiting. She told him about Ada, and the wedding behind the thin plaster wall, and the long walk into the fog. She had never said any of it aloud before. And the strange thing, the thing she had not expected, was that saying it to this quiet, grieving man did not make the wound deeper. It made it lighter. For the first time since the neighbor had spoken those careless words over the garden fence, Marielle did not feel like a coat left hanging in the hall. She felt like a person who had been seen. The days became weeks. Marielle did not leave. There was always, it seemed, another clock in the great house that needed her, and the truth that they both danced around was that the house had begun to need her far more than its clocks did. She brought every stopped mechanism back to life, one by one, until the whole estate ticked and chimed and breathed with the sound of moving time. Mrs. Halden, the old housekeeper, began to hum in the kitchen again. The Duke began to walk in the garden, then to ride out across his land, then to laugh, a sound so rusty at first that it startled them both. And slowly, in the careful, patient way that Marielle did all her best work, something grew between the clockmaker's daughter and the lonely Duke that neither of them had dared to hope for again. But the past, as I told you, was not finished with her. It came on a gray afternoon, in the form of a hired coach, rattling up the long gravel drive, and a man stepping down from it in a travel-worn gray coat. It was Thomas. He had found her at last. Marielle saw him from the upstairs window, and her whole body went cold. 3 years of waiting, and one terrible wedding rushing back all at once. She went down to meet him in the gravel courtyard, because she would not let him into the house that had become her refuge, and she stood before him with her hands folded and her chin steady. And Thomas, the man who had promised himself to her under the pear tree, looked at her with an expression of raw misery, and began to speak. He told her the marriage to Ada had been a mistake. He told her that the loneliness of the eastern provinces had confused him, that Ada's letters had charmed him from a distance, but that the woman herself was not what he had imagined, that the two of them quarreled bitterly, and that the bright laughter which had drawn him across all those miles had curdled into something cold. He told her that he lay awake at night thinking of Marielle, of her steady hands and her patient heart, and that he had come to beg her forgiveness. And then he said the thing he had truly come to say. He asked her to come back to him. He said it was not too late, that Ada need never know, that the two of them could begin again somewhere far away. He reached into his coat and drew out a ring, a real ring this time, the ring he had never been able to afford 3 years ago, and he held it out to her in the gray afternoon light. Marielle looked at the ring, and then she looked at the man holding it, this man she had given 3 years of her life to, and she waited to feel the old longing rise up in her chest. She waited for her heart to leap the way it had leapt when she thought he was coming home, but it did not leap. It did not even stir. Standing there in the courtyard of the great house, with the clocks ticking faintly through the open windows behind her, Marielle felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt free. Because the woman Tomas was asking to come back was a woman who no longer existed. That woman had walked into the fog and never come out. The woman standing before him now had rebuilt herself the same way she rebuilt a ruined watch, piece by careful piece, and she had no intention of handing herself back to the man who had broken her in the first place. She told him no. She told him gently, because she was not a cruel woman, and she could see that his regret was real. But she told him plainly, and without a single tremor in her voice. She told him that he had taught her something valuable, though he had not meant to. He had taught her that waiting for someone to choose you is no way to spend a life, and that a love which has to be kept secret is not a love worth having. She told him to go home to Ada, and to learn to love the wife he had chosen, because running from one mistake into another would only break a third heart, along with the 2 he had already broken. And then she did the kindest and most final thing she could think of. She reached into her own pocket and drew out his father's old watch, the one she had brought back to life all those years ago, the one she had wound every single night through 3 long years of waiting. She placed it in his palm and closed his fingers over it, just as her father had once closed her fingers over his small fold of money. She told him the promise it carried was finished, and that it was time he carried it himself. Then she turned and walked back toward the house, and she did not look back, not even once. The Duke was waiting for her in the doorway. He had seen the whole thing from the window, the coach and the man and the ring, and there was a question in his eyes that he was too proud and too wounded to ask aloud. He had lost one love to a cruel accident of fate, and he had clearly braced himself to lose this one to a man from her past. But Marielle walked straight up the steps to him and took both his hands in hers, the way Tomas had once taken hers beneath the pear tree, and she told him the truth. She told him she was not going anywhere. She told him that for 3 years she had waited for a man to choose her, and that she had finally understood she had been waiting in the wrong direction the entire time. The choosing, she had learned, was hers to do, and she chose him. She chose the quiet, grieving Duke, who had let a half-drowned stranger through his iron gates on the worst night of her life. She chose the man who had watched her hands among the gears and seen, not a servant or a stranger, but an equal. They were married in the spring, beneath the blossoming trees in the garden of the great house, with old Mrs. Halden weeping happily into her gray shawl, and Marielle's father Hendrik standing proudly at her side, his ink-stained hands trembling as he gave her away. It was a small wedding, nothing like the hasty, crowded affair behind the thin plaster wall, but every soul present was there because they loved the bride and the groom, and that made all the difference in the world. The Duke walked her down the garden path without his cane, leaning instead on her arm, and the two of them moved together slowly and steadily, in no hurry at all. because they had both learned the hard way that the best things are never rushed. Marielle Ravensmore lived a long and full life in that house on the hill. She turned the cold, silent estate into a home full of warmth and light, and the gentle music of 100 clocks all keeping perfect time. She and Aldrich had children who grew up climbing the same garden trees, and she taught those children, as her father had taught her, that good things take patience, that you must never rush a delicate mechanism, and that the most beautiful things in life are the ones assembled slowly and with care. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were asleep, the Duke and his clockmaker would sit together by the great long-case clock in the hall, the very one she had brought back to life, and they would listen to it tick. To anyone else, it was only a clock, but to the two of them, that steady, faithful sound meant something more. It was the sound of two broken people who had been told they were beyond repair and who had proven the whole world wrong. It was the sound of time, no longer an enemy to be feared, but a gift to be spent well, together, for all the years they had left. And that, my friends, is the story of the woman who waited 3 years for the wrong man, only to be chosen, at last, by the right one.